We've got an interesting topic this week: decision making and creativity, which is one of my more favourite topics. I have had a bit of a complaint about the volume level of my YouTube videos, so I'm putting the headset on this week. And on a much less happy note, I was planning to go to the movies tonight, and then I remembered I'd promised to get these 2 weeks of videos up. I'm sorry I have been late. I've been, as you know, working on the marking processes. I know many of you out there hate me for it because I am indeed a tough marker, but let's say it's better that I start tough and that we, gradually, hopefully we'll see better assignments as the semester progresses, and you will get better marks, I'm sure of it, if you take a bit of note of some of the obvious stuff that I did point out for some of you anyway. Some of you did extremely well, of course, because you are very, very diligently followed the instructions on the website and also had a good look at the example that I did post to Moodle. All right, let's get going with this one. As I say, a bit of a fun topic, and decision making effectively is a conscious process of making choices when you've got more than one possible choice with the intention of moving forward towards some sort of desired state of affairs or some outcome. Now, traditionally, when we think about decision making, we tend to think of it in very logical and rational terms. And we have this kind of dream in our head of how decision making should take place. And it sort of theorizes that good decision makers, they identify and select a perfect choice from amongst a range of alternatives based on something that's called subjective expected utility, which is aimed at picking the best of many choices based on all sorts of weightings and other decisions. And we go through this systematic process of decision making, which is logical, rational, and follows good quality decision making sense. That's how we think we make decisions. Now, this issue of subjective utility, just so that you know, you've got a number of different choices here on the screen, and you think ahead, you extrapolate from a particular choice the kind of outcome you'll get out of that, and you measure that the utility or value of that outcome, and then compare it with the utility of these alternative outcomes, and work out which of these outcomes has the best utility from your subjective point of view. That's what that means. Working at it, or you also try and work out the probability of these different events occurring and measure it against this utility or value. Now, the concept of utilitarianism, very quickly, it's something in the textbook. It's one of those terms that is kind of handy. It's the greatest good for the greatest number. But moving on to how the rational model really works, it works in this kind of fantastic, almost computer-like process where you identify the problem, you establish decision-making criteria that are objective, you weigh each option out of your alternatives, you choose the best alternative, you implement the decision, then you evaluate how it went, and if it didn't work out perfectly, you move back and make another decision again. Lovely, in theory. As I said in class when I gave this lecture, more often than not, it works in a very different way. So pick me going to a restaurant. I'm hungry, so I'm in a bit of a hurry to choose. I know that there's going to be a queue in terms of the kitchen. Who the chef gets to first is whoever orders first. And I've got this big menu in front of me, and I'm always overwhelmed by menus, apart from the fact that dim lighting in restaurants makes me, puts me off my food. So the way I actually choose is somewhat more similar to the way we all do choose when we're faced with a choice, a subjective choice. I choose by picking the first menu option that is satisfactory to me. So if things have got prawns in them, I don't like prawns, I eliminate that. I don't particularly like calamari based, anything to do with an octopus's leg puts me off my food, so I miss out those. But as soon as I get one that hasn't got prawns, hasn't got calamari in it, I'm straight for it, that will do. So if there's a specials board, I pick the top one. Now that's actually somewhat similar. We do not evaluate all our choices in this kind of simultaneous weighing process. We eliminate choices based on a variety of shortcuts. Now, the rational choice decision model assumes we're logical, efficient computers, but in fact we're hungry diners at a menu of choices. And we have emotions such as hunger and impatience and anger, and we have cognitive limits in terms of processing power, which fall short of the kind of ideal that the model presumes in humans. Now, I'll be talking a little bit further about group impacts on decision making, but when you are making decisions, a couple of the key ones that we'll talk about are, be flexible and fight the urge to look decisive, because we've got, particularly in modern Western tradition, we've got this concept of the leader as being, the decisive he-man, who is able to quickly make a snap, decisive decision. And as you can imagine from the rational choice models, that's not particularly compatible with good quality decisions that assess all options and weigh them up properly. Be aware that you have limits, so be aware of these perceptual and other limitations. We'll talk more about them. Be averse to being complacent about your abilities and skills. Be aware of the dangers that groupthink and group shift can bring to bear upon decision making, and be aware as well as be aware of the value and the risks of intuition, which we will talk about. Now, the evidence from organisational behaviour that challenges the rational choice model is that, in fact, goals in themselves are disputed, ambiguous. We don't all agree on them. We rarely put the work into defining the elements of goals that are compatible with all of our positions. We come from many different positions in life, and we all presume that everyone has the same values and positions, and we all operationalise a good outcome in the same way, when in fact we do not do so. And of course we do have limited processing power, and of course we do not, like me in a restaurant, I do not go through the entire menu. We do not evaluate all alternatives at the same time. We do it sequentially. So quite often we evaluate alternatives against a favourite. In my case, everything's evaluated against ice cream, and subsequently everything falls short. And we often choose the first possibility, as I do, of a good enough option, which is called satisficing, as opposed to satisfying. Some problems with problem identification. The textbook talks briefly about this, but we use mental models, or what psychologists call schema. And those schema are formed by early experience quite often with a particular kind of problem, and often the wrong schema is applied to a new problem. The example I gave in class was that, when we're choosing a wife or a husband, for example, we may well be using, as managers, the kind of mental model we've built up from choosing a HR manager or choosing a foreman in the factory. And there's a lovely quote in there about Einstein, who said that if he had an hour to save the world, he would spend a full 55 minutes of that hour defining the problem. And we, in fact, do not spend that time focusing on identifying the problem clearly and making sure we all agree with the basic content of the problem. We'll talk more about emotions, and the other problem that the textbook identifies, and I can relate to this personally, is that we tend to encapsulate problems in an inappropriate way and instead focus on a solution to a problem rather than the problem itself. So I think it's better that I talk about in the sense of some of the decision-making flaws, which I will do, because the kind of example I want to give would take fully half an hour to give you. But the textbook, anyway, you may want to have a quick look at the textbook in relation to this. Now, I'll very quickly go over some of the examples of the kind of biases that I just referred to. Overconfidence bias is fairly clear. It's the bias that we experience where we have an overconfidence in our own ability, not just to make decisions, but overconfidence in our own ability to carry them out. Overconfidence in our abilities, full stop. Anchoring bias is a lovely one. It's a great one that we'll talk about in the future when we talk about negotiation in a later chapter. But just very quickly, if you're out buying a car off Gumtree, for example, you're better off making a very, very low pitch in terms of the price that you offer. The lower you make it, the lower the evidence suggests the final price will be. So, for example, if I say to you on a particular unknown outcome, and I say to you, what percentage of children in America are born with HIV? More or less than 3%. Your final figure, when I mention the 3%, will anchor around that 3% figure. I don't actually know what the figure is, but I can tell you that if I'd said 15%, your result would have been higher than if I'd set as my anchor point 3%. Wherever that first bid is, so to speak, that's the anchoring bias. Sunk costs. The issue of sunk cost is a particularly important one in relation to business. What happens in business when we make decisions is we don't do them very well, as I've implied, and then we invest money in that outcome in a business sense, and we invest, let's say, $50,000 in the first year, and it doesn't go that well, then we sink more money into it, and we commit more and more money to a project, and then are more and more fearful of pulling out because of the costs that we've sunk into that project. There's famous cases like the Vietnam War where whole countries have escalated their commitment to something, a losing war, and have feared pulling out and hesitated in pulling out, even though had they known back when they started that it was going to take 15 years and tens of thousands of lives and billions and trillions of dollars, they would not have agreed to that decision. Hindsight bias is one of those cases, again, important one for managers, is, managers are very wise in hindsight. And this is a human failing. We will look back and say, I already knew that this project was going to fail or going to succeed. Aren't I a great manager? And that leads to the overconfidence bias. Availability heuristic relates to us using as examples in future calculations of the likelihood of certain things happening or not, examples whether they're fresh and available to mind. So, for example, if we've had a Filipino employee on a couple of occasions perform extremely well on the factory floor, we're more likely to take them as being want to take on a Filipino employee because the availability heuristic tells us Filipinos are great. And we're not talking stereotypes here, but the availability of good quality, colourful examples that are top of mind. For example, we're all anxious about home invasions or terrorist threats, and we're anxious about those things, partly because those are highly available through television network news, not because they are actually highly probable events. And again, we've got all these issues like the randomness error with understanding probability. Humans, even experts, are not great at understanding issues like that. Have a look at Kahneman and Tversky on, for example, Wikipedia. There's a whole world in there that is really worth looking at to do with how we frame decision making. It's a little bit beyond what I can talk about in a half an hour YouTube, and we're already halfway through my half an hour YouTube. But just to give you an example, would you rather get a $5 discount or avoid a $5 surcharge on a particular product that you were to buy? So technically they both involve $5 deviation from a kind of baseline. A discount is a $5 drop in price, and a surcharge is a $5 increase in price. They're both $5, but one's above the line and one's below the line. my hand movements are rather inappropriate there. The evidence shows that we are much more averse to a cost, such as a $5 surcharge, than we are attracted by a cut, like a $5 discount. So if you are thinking about changing prices of a product in your range as manager, you will find you'll get a much more negative impact when you put your prices up by 5%. Then you'll get a positive impact from dropping your prices by 5%. So then we have this phenomenon known as a loss aversion. And there's a number of other things, such as endowment effect, which are really worth looking at. Which is, endowment effect, just very briefly, is this the emotional and psychological value that comes from owning a product. And there's some really beautiful experiments illustrating that the moment you have possession of something, it gains dramatically in value. There's similar studies, by the way, and anyone who's been married for a few years will know this one, that once you've had it for a little too long, it almost disappears in value. But as soon as someone tries to take it away from you, then suddenly the endowment effect kicks in. You'll find that husbands who've been fairly neglectful of their wives get extremely interested in their wives when some other man shows interest in their wife, or their wife threatens to walk away, for example. These are all elements of the endowment effect. All right. There are a number of reasons that we suffer from deficiencies in our decision-making prowess, and I've sort of looked at some of those. We sometimes are limited by policy and the law into what kind of decisions we can make. We have risk-averse personalities. We're sometimes rewarded for behaving in risky or inappropriate ways, and gender does play a role, more of that in a minute. And also the issue of time constraints. If you put people under pressure, which is one way of, let's say, making reducing their resources to make good quality systematic decisions, then yes, you are more likely to make flawed decisions under those circumstances. And the whole issue of emotions, I do want to point out that there is evidence that emotions do play a good quality role in decisions. We tend to give emotions a bit of a bad rap. When we say that someone is emotional, we actually mean bad. So, just to twist that story around a little bit, think about if we had no emotions in decision making, some of the terrible decisions we would make, the heartless decisions we would make, going back to a personal sense. If we didn't have the emotion of faith and trust and love, for example, would we stay with a partner when they grow old, or when a better option came along, or when they became ill, for example? So motivations do motivate people, they improve our ethical thinking, they also give us unconscious information about alternatives beyond what we would just come up with rationally. And the other point worth making about emotions, which is really interesting for you as students, is that they do govern the way we remember things. So, for example, if you tend to read your McShane textbook with a glass of wine in a great state of relaxation, your likelihood of remembering things during an exam when you're in a state of high nerves and tension are much reduced. It's almost better to read the textbook in a bit of a state of tension so that the emotion matches the moment when you're trying to recall all that information during an exam period. That's emotionally congruent information. I think I'll let that on the screen for a minute. You can pause and have a bit of a look, but it isn't a particularly important part of this assignment. And I'll also skip that bit. That was a fun bit during my lecture, but fun doesn't equate to important enough to put up on YouTube. Now, talking about intuition here, and I've bring that up. Intuition is the ability to sense a problem or an opportunity and then make a decision without conscious reasoning. Now, the part of that definition is that the key is that intuitive decisions are those made without obviously conscious reasoning. And you could almost say that it involves this rapid, non-conscious analysis. And good intuition, as opposed to bad intuition, comes from heavy experience in a particular area of decision making. When I say bad intuition, what I mean by that is this raw gut feeling that people say, I've just got a gut feeling that, there's a crisis going to happen in the world economy next week. And if you're not an economist and you don't read the newspaper very much, these intuitions, these gut feelings are probably based upon breakfast or the wine you drank last night, or just a general mood effect, rather than on any real good quality reason. Now, sometimes these emotional signals, just like the decision about whether to marry someone or not, based upon your experience as a HR manager, may involve very inappropriate or distant schema or mental structures in your brain that aren't relevant. But what you're looking for when you're looking for good quality intuition is, let's say that your job is a welder and you get to weld particular joints in metal on a regular basis, hundreds of times a day, and test them in strength testing on hundreds of times a day. You may well be picking up signals about good quality or bad quality welding based upon stuff that you're not even aware of, because you have really heavily overlearned and over-experienced a particular kind of process. Now, in human things, this kind of thing happens a lot. HR managers do become better with time at kind of picking people, and they don't really know why they pick them. They just got this gut feeling, and that gut feeling is based on something. It's based on experience. Now, as I say, in relation to decision making, you need to be aware of these shortcomings in your decision making and try and use them to improve the quality of your decision making. So one of the things in relation to group decision making that I do like to emphasize is that try and create different centers of power. So don't just have the whole group dynamic and that group cohesion working against good quality decision making. In relation to that overcommitment or that the sunk costs issue, try and establish beforehand triggers. If we reach a loss of 150,000 on this project, and it's an XYZ hasn't yet happened, we will abandon the project. Set them in stone and stick to them, because you set them in stone conservatively and say, look, it may take 4 years to get this project going, and we may lose 200,000 or 300,000. What's the absolute maximum time we're prepared to wait and amount of money we're prepared to lose before we abandon the project? Be sensible about it, pick a figure, and then stick to it. Try and organise to get good quality, systematic, clear feedback from people who know. And here you need to again be careful of the social limitations and the social laws. So for example, if you ask a friend, do I look good in this? Your friend is more than likely to tell you that you do. That's not good quality feedback. On the other hand, even with your friends, you can improve that feedback by begging for it. You can say things like, I don't really look good in this colour, do I? And beg for it. And if you do look good in that colour, they'll let you know. But if you don't, if there's some doubt, you've begged for it, you're clearly ready to hear negative feedback, you'll get good quality feedback. I'm making some of these key points again and again. Let's turn to the other topic of this week. The other key topic is creativity. Creativity involves developing original and important ideas. So novelty is one aspect of creativity. The fact that it has some kind of value and is non-trivial is the other important aspect of creativity. So it's the ability to produce novel and practical solutions to problems, ability to generate unique approaches to problems, or divergent thinking as we call it as well. Just quickly, a little bit like with intuition, there is an element of experience or expertise, as I've written it up here, in creativity. There's also, are you a creative person? Do you have some kind of individual difference that relates to creativity? And we do differ on that, let's be honest. And also, are you motivated to come up with a solution? If you bring all these three characteristics, you've got some genuine creativity, you've got skill in the area, and you're motivated to it, then you see this light bulb moments start to happen a little bit more frequently. That's called the three-component model of creativity. And I think I can leave that quote. If you wanted to look at it, you can pause. There are three components, or three stages, if you like, of creativity that are key. The preparation, where you do the basic gathering of expertise or knowledge. The incubation, which often involves unconscious processes or rumination. You sleep on it, for example, or go for a bicycle ride while you let these things percolate in your mind. Followed by that illumination, that moment that creativity is famous for, that light bulb moment after that period of fringe awareness. The verification is where you actually check, the more final stages, that you check that the idea is practical and has some value. Now, there are some components or elements of humans that are associated with creativity, and that includes, openness, and that's from the 5-factor personality that we talked about, the Camus, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and the O was openness. Moderately low need for affiliation, so people who are not particularly group orientated in their social needs, strong stimulation and self-direction values, again, the ability to work things out for yourself and drive yourself, high need for achievement, strong task motivation, and there's that word motivation, reasonably positive self-esteem and optimism. I personally find that one way I can solve creative problems is sort of geeing myself up in almost like that American self-help book sort of style. Oh, life, you can do it. And of course there's this knowledge and experiences, expertise assists, and not being locked into a particular mindset, which can actually, oddly enough, come from the opposite side of things, a lack of knowledge and expertise. I do find it useful when I'm trying to solve a problem, and there's evidence to show that this is generally true. It's sometimes good to talk about that problem with a non-expert, because they can break up the preconceptions that you're bringing into an area of expertise that you have. And of course, the ability to synthesize many different options, to handle a whole menu of different options, to analyze, evaluate potential usefulness of ideas. These are some of the organisational factors that support creativity. Of course, there's a learning orientation in the organisation, a forgiveness for mistakes, which supports risk, encouragement of intrinsic motivation rather than just rewards-based, just money, or other kind of bonuses do not support true creativity, because kind of fear of not getting those bonuses reduces risk orientation in individuals within an organisation. Open communication, support from the leadership. So, if you, again, it relates to that issue of risk, your leadership will support you through thick and thin, when you get it right and when you get it wrong. And of course, this issue of resources. We talked about time, for example, as a key. I'll just show you a couple of studies which also demonstrate, for those of you who are preparing for the first assignment, the major assignment, how I like to see you present data. Notice here, for example, likewise, Katz and Allen found that for engineers working on new technologies, uninterrupted time was considered to be critical. Evidence, reference, a study that showed something was helpful. Support from leadership. Andrews and Farris, 1967, found that scientists' creativity was higher when managers listened to their employees' concerns and asked for their input into decisions affecting them. So this is just a nice little moment where I would like to demonstrate the kind of way I want you to talk to me in your assignments, and where I think most of academics who will be marking your work at CQ, that's the way we like to hear things. And of course, using Harvard style, which all drives us nuts. So, I think The other section of the textbook that I wanted to talk about briefly was this issue of involvement. This is what the McShane textbook uses as a term. Other people refer to this as engagement. The degree to which an employee can impact on how their work is organised and carried out is often defined as involvement. Involvement in employees is an important factor, but it tends to be more important when problems within an organisation are new and complex rather than routine, for example, and boring. When employees have knowledge out on the factory floor or the front line that bosses may not have, that's when you really want employees involved and engaged, because they're a resource to you. If you don't know something that they do and they have access to information that you don't, the more involved your employees are in decision making, for example, the better. It's also important involvement in helping improve commitment of employees to an organisation. And when employees would lack commitment without involvement, that's when you really want it. It's important also having involvement when your goals, or the firm's goals, and employees' goals tend to be aligned. And when that alignment takes place, then involvement is more key. So, employee involvement tends to lead to some very nice outcomes, like better problem identification, stronger commitment to decisions. So, and better decisions. When I say commitment to decisions, it's one of the most important aspects of involvement. I do want to bring this one up, a particular emphasis on this. If you make decisions within your organisation and you do it in a unilateral way, as the boss hammering the boardroom table and just yelling at people and telling them this is the way it's going to be, whether you like it or not, it's quick, decisive, and you'll be remembered for it when it goes wrong. But importantly, it's much more difficult to get commitment from employees for decisions that you made without consulting, for example. Anyway, let's go backwards and have a look at some of these contingencies. Decision structure. So if a decision is pre-programmed and routine, when everything follows through policy factors or legal factors, not much point having involvement, it's less point. If, as I said, employees know more about what's going on in an organisation than you do in certain cases, then involvement's more important. Again, the commitment, which I just talked about, if employees won't accept a decision unless they're involved, then of course involvement's more important. And this issue of conflict. Employees' goals and your goals have to be in alignment, otherwise involvement is not so helpful. And that's it for the week. 33 minutes, not too bad. I'm receiving a lot of emails for you in the wake of having sent out the 8% or 10% first assignment. And I do welcome it. I actually absolutely loathe sending out 320 emails, but I really don't mind hearing from you in the wake. I'm trying to keep up with those flood of emails that are coming through now. So you should be getting fairly prompt replies, but just keep badgering me. No problem. Thanks very much.